Hi, welcome. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum, and thank you for joining us tonight for the second of our fall series of book talks, which is a very eclectic series. Tonight, Claire Zimmerman is going to talk about her book, Albert Kahn Inc., Architecture, Labor, and Industry, 1905 to 1961. A really beautiful book and just a very impressive work of scholarship from the point of view of history and historiography, but also archival work. And this is actually the launch of the talk about the talks that will come in the future, I suppose, about this book. But it was published only last month, and this is the first time that Claire has talked about it to the general public, but you all are many friends and professionals. So I'm going to plan to get off the camera very quickly and let Claire take over, and then hope that we have some time for questions and answers afterwards. But this book follows, well, for those of you who don't know Claire, she is a professor of architecture that now teaches at the University of Toronto, the Daniels faculty, which is called the professor of where she also directs the PhD program in architecture, landscape, and design. She formerly taught at the University of Michigan. She studied first as an undergraduate in architecture at UPenn. She then went to Harvard for her MArch and then did a PhD at CUNY in the history of architecture. This book has, speaking of the history of architecture, it has a very lovely blurb, well, very, I think, acute blurb on the back of the book by Adrian Forty, who is, of course, at the University College of London, where he writes, "In a truly alternative history of modern architecture, Zimmerman repatriates industrial architecture from its long-time outcast status back to the heart of the discipline. Drawing on extensive new documentary research, her account of the social, political, economic, and cultural ramifications of the work of Kahn, the Kahn office, is superb." There are many other points of praise, but I think if we just let Claire talk tonight, we'll be impressed and have historical questions to ask you. So Claire's Carol,
thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Daniel, and the rest of the staff here at the Skyscraper Museum. It's really very nice to be here and to be finally launching this book, which took 2 years in production, probably all my fault, but definitely tied up with MIT Press also. When I moved to Michigan from New York in 2006, I really didn't know very much about Albert Kahn. I knew he was a factory architect. I'd probably seen a book by the Italian scholar Federico Bucci with the subtitle Architect of Ford, which was how he was known. I had probably learned a few things about his buildings in graduate school, but nothing had really sunk in. But when I got to Ann Arbor, I began to notice a kind of architecture that seemed characteristically North American and belonging to a certain era, pre-World War II, but certainly 20th century, solid, staid, conventional buildings with some rather underemphasized traditional detailing, with a kind of echo of historical style or styles. These were very no-nonsense buildings sprinkled around the campus. Quite clear about function in a certain way, quite modern in some ways, very traditional in others. They were often brick, often classically detailed, but in this kind of minimal way that I've been describing, a minimalist classicizing architecture, it seemed to me. I found them quite prosaic and not very interesting, although they struck one as being very well built. It took me some time to discover their secrets. You're looking at West Engineering, and inside that building is this wonderful flotation tank for testing naval engineering models. And it is here, Carol, that we think perhaps the first truss-con experiments took place, the first reinforced concrete using the truss-con system, although we don't actually know for sure. Over the first few years that I lived in Michigan, I was working hard on a project about photography and how it spread ideas about architecture, and specifically modern architecture. I had grown interested in how it was that buildings could proliferate in images while still remaining unique, one-off, bespoke, designed objects of elite culture, all at the same time. This was the magic of photography. Once I completed that project on the mass reproduction of architecture, my mind turned to other kinds of mass production, specifically the mass production of buildings. At that point, given where I was situated, Albert Kahn Inc. Became impossible to ignore. I had also learned, of course, that many of the buildings that surrounded me on campus, as I've just shown you, were actually built by the firm, which is not something that I knew when I moved there, or that any other people that I knew. The firm had played a major role in the modernization of the campus when its principal served as a member of the powerful Committee of Five in the 1920s. So the whole makeup of the University of Michigan Central Campus owed a great debt to Albert Kahn. There began a project, and here I am 10 years later, having concluded one phase of this project about this architectural firm and its global impact. Why was I interested in this version of mass production architecture? It seemed to define a kind of limit condition of architecture, and we can talk about that more later, perhaps. The very first thing I published about Albert Kahn was about the scale of the practice, the scale of the archive, and the daunting size of any attempt, or the daunting task of any attempt to take stock of the firm's work. All three of these challenges were quite intimidating to me. And they placed the firm closer to the camp of engineering firms than to high-profile architecture, which is basically where I had cut my teeth as a historian. For the first, the scale of the practice, I found over 1,900 distinct project numbers in the firm database from the beginning of the century to the death of the founder in 1942, to which might be added over 500 more job numbers from the campuses on which the firm collaborated when they helped the Soviet Union in the first 5-year plan to industrialize. And as for those 1,900 project numbers, there were frequently multiple jobs associated with each project number. For quick comparison, according to Neil Levine, Frank Lloyd Wright is estimated to have completed under 500 projects in his lifetime, one that lasted 17 years longer than Kahn's. And when I had begun this project, there was this wonderful website, which is now since been taken down, called 400 Buildings by Albert Kahn in Detroit, in the city alone. Now, I wasn't the only person working on Albert Kahn out there in Michigan. Several books have come out or are coming out on this topic, many of them by local Michigan historians who are intensely devoted to Kahn's work. I want to direct you to those books for important additions to the record of the firm's work and analysis of some of its earlier phases. What they do is very, very different from what I am trying to do in this book. I would note that 2 of those books are not about Albert Kahn. One is about Julius Kahn and his concrete so-called revolution, and another is about Wirt Rowland, who was a very gifted designer who worked first for Kahn and then for the Smith Group. While I was interested in the figure of the architect, his family, and his firm, I was more interested in what this work meant for the history of architecture in the modern period. It seemed to me that Albert Kahn Inc., which I'm going to shorten to AKI for the rest of the talk, had been interestingly ignored in the history of architecture in which I was trained by none other than the likes of Barry Bergdahl, in fact. By which I mean the scale of the practice was so large that it seemed as if it should have merited greater consideration by historians and architects over the decades since the principal died in 1942. Instead, it had been tidily dismissed by Henry Russell Hitchcock and others like him. The impact of the concrete and then building products company Truss-Kahn, for example, remains inadequately measured, despite Michael Smith's book on the American branch of the company, Trustcon. What interests me is the firm's global footprint, enlarged by its use of British imperial networks. The image on the right is from the British Library. And the image on the left is from the Library of Concrete, also in London. We had a suspicious gap, in other words, in our accounts of this architecture firm. It seemed the scale of the office and the nature of its output was the cause of this gap. Relatedly, Kahn was and is not seen as a good architect by many in the field. He was not up to date in the non-style style. Quote, as an architect, he was a pig, Andrei Buroff is quoted as saying. And this remark, I have to tell you, our very dear and much missed friend, Jean-Louis Cohen, repeated at the firm to the manager of the archive in my presence during a field trip there in 2017, which was a wonderful moment. But as ideas about good architecture have changed over the course of my professional career, such judgments no longer seemed accurate or relevant or adequate. So I started off. It was a very hard book to write for the simple reason that the firm built so much work. There were so many records of certain types, like construction photographs, 85,000, for example, and cost records, thousands of them, and so few records of things that architectural historians really depend on, specifically job correspondence and even building specifications. I had never worked very closely with specifications as an architectural historian, although one appreciated one when one found them. My feeling about specifications now is that you don't know how valuable they are until you have to do without them. There were, of course, also tons and tons of drawings. So many drawings, actually, that you couldn't hope to look at them all, that you need a different way of processing them. There are thousands and thousands of them, not all of them housed in a library or an archive. Many are still at the firm in Detroit. Many have been discarded over the years. The image on the bottom right, that archive no longer exists. The firm has moved from that building to a different building, and in the process, they threw out dumpster after dumpster of material. Before recent interest in the firm, if a building was demolished, its drawings were discarded since the firm would never be called back to work on that building again. Similarly, it was office practice to throw away job correspondence after 10 years to make room for new job correspondence. These kinds of protocols were extremely daunting when I started this project. When I first learned about them, I was stupefied by the logic, so sensible for a busy architectural office, so devastating for a historian. But the book was also difficult to write because the buildings did not demand from me the one thing that I thought I did well, close formal analysis of architecture. I had to find a different way to bring my skills as an analyst of architecture to this work. And that challenge seemed one worth taking on rather than repeating something that I had already done. I'm not in favor of working on the same thing for 25 years at a stretch. There was one building that fascinated me by the Kahn firm, at least. It was this building, as published in Adolf Behne's Modern Functional Building, translated from the German to English when I was studying at the Grad Center with Rosemary Bletter. It's Detroit Seamless Steel Tubes, 1919. It seemed to Behne, I suppose, to represent a perfectly seamless, forgive the pun, example of a building exemplifying its function in its form, a building made of 3 tubular sheds dedicated to making tubes without seams, the latest money-making technology in the relentless game of competitive production in Detroit in 1919, the winning card in that game for a little while. I spent a fair bit of time exploring this building after I finally found it in Dearborn, now completely covered in enameled corrugated metal, and now dedicated to robotic manufacturing that is a perfect fit for its now darkened interior. The metal coat was dropped over seamless steel tubes in like a blanket in the mid-1970s. And this has spawned a new project for which I needed an architect collaborator. And I think finally I have found one. because this is, of course, not the only building that was covered, so draped during the oil shocks of the 1970s. But the temporal frames of this building, daylight manufacturing, artificially lit manufacturing, and robotic manufacturing in the dark, presented an interesting portrait of US-based manufacturing from the 20th to the 21st century. And for me, the building continues to offer food for thought. In the end, what I found was a very different kind of architectural production in the Kahn office from ones I was familiar with from my training as an architect and from my academic work previously. Like their most important clients, the architects weren't building one-offs. They were building with the idea of mass production in mind. Not just inside the building to make cars, assemblies, or parts in Detroit car factories, but rather as a goal of architecture. The buildings themselves were intended to be reproduced. They might be improved or adapted from one iteration to the next, but the industrial buildings were definitely intended to be replicated with as little repetition of work in the office as possible, and other buildings were actually similarly repetitive, non-factory buildings. This is simply not like any architecture I had ever studied before. Architects and historians were trained for decades to look at one-offs, at least in the modern period. When I was starting this book, it's not so true now. The idea that architecture is an art has, however, made it very difficult for architectural historians to see buildings as outputs, which they also are. The closest that we have is, of course, housing, which is expected to be repetitive, modular, and scaled. And there's not really any housing in this firm, very little. But pretty much all of their other buildings, not just their factories, were not intended as one-offs, but rather as models or types or both. What this meant was that the design phase was never the most important phase of the building's production. Design allowed for incorporation of information from prior projects and provided whatever new drawings were required to adapt an existing design to a new site and a new program. Construction then enacted those drawings in a building on a site, and the information from that process was fed back into the office for the next round of design and construction of a similar building. The third phase, the building's occupation, also mattered. Just as construction provided feedback into design, so did the occupation of the buildings provide another source of feedback into both design and construction. So, for example, concrete floors turned out to be very hard on workers who had to stand all day in this building, the Highland Park Ford plant, where wooden floors were quickly installed over concrete ones in response to worker complaints that their feet were killing them. This idea of feedback loops seemed to recur everywhere that I looked in the Kahn practice. So it led me to divide up the book into three main body chapters in the middle, one on processes of design in the office, one on the process of getting things built on sites, and a third on the way in which they were occupied, not by clients so much as by clients' employees, by workers. Each of these chapters covers a similar span of years, and in some case, a project appears more than once, or different but similar projects appear with these different lenses. These three chapters are preceded by a brief, and the subtitle for those chapters is drawn from the 1857 Notebook 7. Nature builds no machines, no locomotives, railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules, etc. These are products of human industry, natural material transformed into organs of the human will over nature or of human participation in nature. They are organs of the human brain, created by the human hand, the power of knowledge objectified. These three main chapters at the center of the book are preceded by a brief summary analysis of industrial architecture and a biographical chapter about the Kahn people, which includes the important early necklace of connected companies that allowed family members to get a foothold commercially in Detroit as an immigrant family, an immigrant Jewish family from Germany. With family members whose English was not fluent. This chapter also deals with the international impact of TrustCon, discusses the crucial role of the brothers, Julius, Moritz and Louis, and sister Molly on the firm's early development. There are a preface and a conclusion and an introduction at the front end, and at the back, a conclusion followed by a couple of appendices. One includes a list of the German language holdings of the very significant, very extensive library that the firm maintained, a library that tells us how the Kahn office learned about buildings being constructed all over the world. One charts the construction photographs for a single building, 235 construction photographs for one building, and one includes a similar chart on the cost cards that were kept to tabulate the cost of a building as it was built. So it begins with this little notebook from 1907, and then it develops into an entire system. And from this set of notebooks on the right of the slide, it goes into a computer terminal and becomes a computerized database of cost of buildings. And I'm sure there's no question that this firm is not unique in keeping such a record, but it is formalized early in the Kahn firm, which I think is one of the things that's interesting. So that's the general layout of the book. And what were my overall findings? I was just going to read a few of the findings that came out of my analysis of this practice, and then we can sort of zoom out a little bit and talk a bit more about the historiographical work. This is in the book. One finds at AKI and in industrialized building of the first half of the 20th century, a series of distinctive design protocols. These included a design process that was modulated by information gained on the construction site and in the occupied buildings in a dynamic yet steady state of change. Enough flexibility in the building itself to allow for reconfigurations of the interior, a time frame of potential use with sufficient longevity to allow the client to recoup the cost of initial construction, as much standardization as possible within any given commission and between commissions, site and program modifications as needed for each new building commission, and architecture designed around human occupants as well as machines. This is the design system, or at least components of the design system developed in the firm and to which many authors on AKI refer. It was not directed towards buildings for elite users and did not rely chiefly on aesthetic address. It evolved through trial and error during a period of dynamic technological and social change. And that is part of the reason why I stop at the 1940s in close analysis of the buildings. The 1961 bracket is a kind of epilogue to the book. So that's the general layout, and I'll just give you a brief sense of some of the things I spent quite a bit of time over in the course of researching and writing the book without taking too much more of your time. I spent a good deal of time on this building, on Highland Park, the Ford plant at Highland Park, and the Ford plant also at River Rouge, just trying to understand the complexity of the layout and the relationship between the moving assembly line and its shell, an industrial building. What I found was a recurrent tension between the mandate of architecture to make things better for the occupants of and around buildings, and the mandates of industrial capitalism to make things more profitable through inventions like the moving assembly line. Generally, it seemed that buildings could serve both worker and industrialist at the front end of a technological breakthrough. But as competition increased and technology aged, things usually fell apart between workers and owners. Because buildings are usually designed and built at the front end of that cycle, this book focuses on the tension between technological breakthroughs and architectural surrounds. And because buildings are generally slow and technology is generally faster, that tension arose again and again. But more importantly, this moment was a crucial historical period in the development of human-machine interfaces. The moving assembly line marked a tipping point between buildings focused on human occupants that used machines or who used machines, and buildings designed for machines that used humans. In the course of investigating, so that's that's Highland Park in its earliest stages, and that's an aerial overview of River Rouge in 1937, and a shot of the interior of one of its buildings. Going back to Highland Park, in the course of investigating this building or this complex, I also realized again and again how omnipresent the world wars were in the development of industrial production at this time. Just to explain the slide that I used at the front of the lecture, you can see this is the extension to what's called the old shop, which is the long bar building that runs the whole length of this image. That's all the old shop. And down here is the first part of the old shop, the earliest part of it from 1910, where the moving assembly line was first formalized and introduced into the building. So the world wars were constantly surfacing, both world wars, in my research for this book. Here we see on the right of the slide the construction of the infamous Eagle boat prototype, first built in the Craneway in town at Highland Park. You'll remember perhaps that River Rouge was initially established for the production of this boat that was meant to fight German submarines in World War I. And it was that project that justified the Army Corps of Engineers building the infrastructure of River Rouge and paying for the building that would make these boats. And then magically in 1919, the war is over. They've managed to get one boat into the conflict. They've got 64 other boats that they have to sell to somebody else. And in fact, I think a couple of them were even used in World War II. But this again is Henry Ford getting the whole infrastructure for his massive River Rouge plant built by the Army Corps of Engineers. So I spent a good bit of time on the relationship between this work and the world wars. I also spent a good deal of time on the Soviet experiment, that is to say, the Kahn firm going to the USSR and consulting on a large-scale architectural office in Moscow with branch offices in different parts of the Soviet Union to build over 500 industrial campuses in the years between 1928 and 1932. That whole fascinating story spawned its own book project in collaboration with Jean-Louis Cohen and Christina Crawford, which is called Detroit, Moscow, Detroit, and that came out in 2023. But for me, it was very much part of this whole project about Albert Kahn. The similarity of technological development, along with some interesting differences between the USSR and the USA, were quite revelatory to me, showing how the development, I don't know why they should have been. Some people in the audience would say that was to be expected. But in any case, it shows how the development of industrial technology followed similar paths despite geographical and political difference. And I spent a good bit of time on the wartime factories themselves, studying just what happened to the firm in the years around World War II, when the speed of production pretty much trumped everything else that was happening in the office and drove everything else out of the office, really. And when the physical construction of what we know as the military industrial complex took place, in buildings like this is a very renowned building for Glen Martin in Middle River, Maryland. And then after the war, continuing in buildings like this, Wright Aeronautical, which is now today GE Aerospace, just outside of Cincinnati. But these post-war constructions really followed the lines laid down in the 1930s for these massive buildings that would be funded by partnerships between the state and the private industrialist. The book the chapters are bookended by these two images, which seem to me more than a little ironic and highly consequentially related. The left one is a sketch made by the young Albert Kahn on his fellowship trip around Europe in the 1890s. The right is the same building after World War II bombardment, possibly by the very planes built in Kahn's factories, which also produced Boxcar and Enola Gay out in the Midwest. And I just have a few closing words about the book, and then I'm ready to take questions about all the things I have not addressed or answered. I would say most of us are working to do what we already do, but better. And this book is, for me, no exception. I definitely wanted to pose for myself a different way of writing architectural history, one that reflected the class critique that is implicitly embedded in this work, not necessarily reflected in the attitudes of its makers. Factory buildings are buildings for the mass publics that architects sometimes claim to speak to, yet these buildings have been the purview of labor historians, generally less interested in building design and construction, and perhaps without the ability to look at it closely. Kahn and his people were architects, draftsmen, and engineers, professionals in creating built environments. They knew what they were doing. Kahn actively explored the work of contemporaries, of which he was often quite skeptical. It wasn't that he didn't know about the Bauhaus, it was that he didn't believe in it. His approach reflected the idea that the violence of modernization needed some amelioration in its delivery vehicles, the buildings that enact it. Buildings should be modern in their technologies, but not in their address. This was, of course, a 19th century attitude, or we think of it as a 19th century attitude. If it weren't for the modernity of the firm's technologies of designs, one would be tempted to say that Kahn was a 19th century type. But no, he was just a Detroit type, embedded in an industry that was also a kind of a discourse. The refusal of academicism and the embrace of technocracy emanate from this work, even as it is also founded on a very conventional idea of architecture as a cultural practice with some roots in past practices. But all this recalls present attitudes to me so keenly. The power of convention, the hatred for elite learning, the embrace of technology, optimization, and profit motives, that we should perhaps be prepared to admit that this engine has been chugging along all the time, paying little attention to the space of academic work, to the very idea of an architecture culture, but highly sensitive to popular consumption and its mores, and ready to take a more violent form if ignored for too long, as it did through the years of World War II, and as it appears to do today. So thank you very much for being here.
All right. I missed the very beginning, and maybe the answer was already there. I was intrigued by the statement that you made just a few seconds ago about labor history. I was talking about what role I was reading and getting engaged with labor historic histories might have played in the way you framed this project, but in particular, if you were in a conversation with a labor historian, how would your view change perhaps of how you think it might impact what they do?
Claire, repeat the question
Make it
to make sure that everyone hears and the microphone hears.
The question is, I think, how is the book in conversation with labor historians, if it is?
Yes, and in what and in feedback loop, what would you expect a labor historian would think about their practice of the way of framing things by encountering your work?
That's a very good question. I find labor historians a little bit insensitive to the importance of situation and setting. And I think that's what we bring to a labor history of architecture is that ability to talk about the importance of the setting itself. So I would say the best example of that is so Sidney Fine, a labor historian, wrote a book about the sit-down strike, which is this kind of major moment in American labor history where the UAW comes into existence. And Fine does a great job of describing how it happened in Flint. And he gestures to the importance of certain aspects of the buildings. He doesn't go deeply into the importance of the architecture itself for how the strikes unfolded, because the Daylight Factory itself, like the building that's on the front of the book, was such an excellent setting for a defensive a defense of the group that held it, that occupied it. So my chapter on occupation is about occupying buildings, but it's also about a defense, a kind of, you know, aggressive occupation of revolutionary occupation of buildings. So I would point to that as a place where I think architecture has something to offer, and it's not even in the fitness of the daylight factory for the sit-down strike that I would see the significance. It's what happened after, which is that in the wake of those strikes, the auto industry totally changed its approach to industrial campus architecture. They pulled the factories back from the street front. They made pinch points for entry and exit. They basically designed around the sit-down strike and prevented it from happening again. And that's not something I've seen a labor historian acknowledge or realize. So I think we have something to offer there. I actually spent a lot of time in this book figuring out or trying to figure out what the architects thought they were bringing to the factories. And it's for that reason that there is actually one building in this book that I look at closely that isn't by the Kahn firm. They did practically everything at River Rouge, but they did not design or build a foundry. And in that chapter, there's in fact, at a couple of points in the book, there's a kind of comparison between what it is that the firm brought to the industrial buildings that they designed at the Rouge versus that building. And I do think that the whole Kahn office was constantly trying to add value to the work, not in terms of money value, but in terms of spatial values. So I would argue that in various instances. I think the Daylight Factory itself was an attempt to design an architecture that would make industrial work better from the time that it started, so around 1905. And that remained the project of the firm for the better part of 20 years at least, I think.
Nice, like, you hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, no, nice. They're really excited to see all the research you're doing, looking at drawings, specifications, contracts, instruments of service. And I'm curious, looking at the Kahn firm's work, did you find specific examples of how they adopted perhaps new or innovative new instruments of service as architects? And if so, you know, are there any examples of that? And so did you see evidence of that actually impacting the field of the profession more widely?
You know, I still haven't gotten to the bottom of the cost issue, but the cost cards, which start out in that little notebook of his, I haven't found records of that kind of precision in other firms. Before him, the closest that we come is probably Daniel Burnham and maybe Hullibert and Root in Chicago. But that business of for the architects to bid out a job, to figure out how cheaply they could do a building, they had to be super, super precise about costs. And McKinsey and White, you know, didn't really need to do that. That just wasn't part of what they had to do to continue as a firm. But for the Kahn firm, it became absolutely crucial. And so I think this business of this, it's a resource that was not in the business office, it was in the design studio. So it was the designers who were constantly looking to these cost cards to see how they could do the next job. So to me, that was at least a contribution. I don't ever in this book, I hope, say anything about firsts, because that's the one thing you learn as a historian to never say. But to me, it was very striking that these records were so precise. In certain ways, they were super precise. Where they were not precise was in the tabulation of what they paid the draftsman.
So in a related question about costs, and you know, you started this seminar on the cost of architecture and kind of all dimensions of meaning of cost, but the cost, tracking the cost of buildings, we know from about skyscrapers, is something that builders usually do, right?
Yes.
So the general contractor as it emerges, but you know, the Skyscraper Museum has Starrett Brothers and Eakins small, very small archive, but one of the books which looks almost exactly like AKI, is Paul Sterrett's job book, which he started when he was working for George Fuller, and it tracks during these same years, like 1906 forward, absolutely everything on the cost of architecture. And so, I mean, my question is, why did architects do that? Was it to prove to the client the value?
I think it was because their design edge depended entirely on their ability to bring it in for less than their competition. And to do that, they had to keep very close tabs on things. So it was typically the builder's task to do that. But in Detroit, where competition was very intense, the architect needed to be in front of that information, as it were.
And was it Ford that was the builder, the contractor, or who was the general contractor?
So for Ford Motor Company, yes, but for the other car companies, different contractors. George Fuller worked with GM, for example. So there were different contractors for different projects, and even the Ford company didn't always contract the work itself. It just, I mean, things were so busy that contracting out was very common in that hypercharged. Yeah. There was something else I was going to say.
Do you think they would have
lost if
they didn't prove their value? Might they have lost out to other architects?
Because Kahn was not he was not a member of the city's group of elite architects. There's he did try to compete for the post office commission in Detroit on 4th Street. And he wrote to Henry Ford to implore him to back his bid for this building, and Ford did not back him. He went for the architect who built one of the main buildings at the Henry Ford. Those are some seriously mediocre buildings, let me tell you. No, I was going to say that early when the firm was still at the Marquette building, the contractors were expected to come to the office and prepare their bid in a special room, a kind of a bid room, and never to take the drawings out of the building. So they streamlined the bidding phase, at least for part of the time that the firm was in operation, by making the contractors come to them, which I think is unusual.
First and foremost, congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to reading this book. I have a lot of questions in and around the photography. In part because of your first book, I'm wondering how that the arguments of that book do come through. You show us some really gorgeous photos and some really interesting photos. And the aerial ones, both interior and exterior, I'm curious, can you talk more about how these were used, not simply, but really not just documents in an archive? How and why and where and
most of the presentation photographs that I showed you were not from the firm. They had their own presentation photographs, but most of those were pretty conventional, and I didn't find myself using them much. Most of the kind of dynamite photographs really come from the Henry Ford, and they are part of the Ford photographic department, where there was a tremendously close attention to how they were produced. What's most interesting in the Kahn archives are the construction photographs, which are also kind of fantastic, but they're less. They're definitely made to document the process of construction. They're just made by these very talented journeyman photographers. They were not ever shown except to the client. And occasionally they would be published. That's not totally correct. Sometimes the construction photographs were taken in order to be published in technical magazines. So you could show, something. And especially when it was a matter of proving how concrete would hold up a certain load. There are lots of those where the floor plates are loaded with sandbags and then the whole thing is photographed. So I think there's a combination of things. One is the sort of the close attention that Ford Motor Company paid to photography and the close attention that the firm paid to getting in progress construction shots. I have done some projects with the photographs. I did an exhibition project called Albert Kahn Under Construction, which had two iterations, one with prints at the University Museum at Ann Arbor, and another as a digital exhibition where we did a kind of immersive, like, build the building or unbuild the building through, a slide array. And I did try to find someone interested in publishing that, but I got nowhere with it. And I was so focused on, completing this project that I let it go. But it's a fantastic amount of work still to be done on that construction archive, which is supposedly 85,000 images. And I got myself into serious hot water out in Michigan because when the firm moved from one building to another, they were going to throw away the rest of the photographs. And I persuaded the Bentley to take what I thought was a selection, and then they felt they had to take all of them, and it consumed their budget for their conservation budget for years. I mean, each print had been in the basement covered with coal dust and whatnot, and each print had to go through a conservation exercise. And really, for a while, they didn't want to see me at all at the library. Did that kind of answer your question? I don't think I have a really good answer for it.
There's such interesting connections with the relationship between photography and corporate history and business history, architecture history aside, in America in the early 20th century, and that
Yes.
kind of the process images and that's such a rich. I don't know how much of that is.
Elspeth Brown started that. Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think when I left the photography project, I really left it basically. And just the way I'm leaving this now, like quickly, as quickly as possible. I think we should not stick on the same things.
I grew up in Detroit and vaguely related to Albert Kahn, and so this has been absolutely fascinating, and I really look forward to reading your book. But I thought, as I listened to you, because it's so different the way I grew up with Albert Kahn, that maybe I could add a little bit about the whole milieu of the Detroit at the time.
Yeah.
Albert Kahn was part of this German Jewish elite who were born in the United States. They were not immigrants, their parents were immigrants. And they flourished with the rise of Detroit in the industrial era, even though they were never directly involved in the auto industry. The relationship between Henry Ford and Albert Kahn, I hope to learn more about in your book because it's so perplexing. Because on one hand, Henry Ford was a notorious anti-Semite, yet Albert Kahn was his favorite architect. So out of that book. Secondly, Albert Kahn was ubiquitous in Detroit. His firm did everything from personal residences to very, very grand, ornate office buildings in the New Center area that were replete with mosaics and a zillion ornamental details, and yet he did these huge, very utilitarian, efficient plants, which at the time were perceived, the daylight plants with all the glass work, the glass roofs, were perceived to be both a tremendous advantage for labor because it allowed more natural light in, but of course it was an efficiency and the cost savings for the owners of these plants because it cut down on artificial illumination and allowed the plants to be used on a 24-hour shift with, of course, additional illumination. I think that at the time, Detroit, as it industrialized, was a hotbed of labor unrest. And at exactly the time in the 30s, when he was most engaged with Henry Ford, were these huge pitched battles between the auto industry, the battle of the overpass. And so I think everybody in Detroit was certainly very, very aware of labor issues, and from all sides. vast about all the personal, recollections I can add. I'm sure you address these all in the book, but
Yeah,
might
thank you.
add a little bit more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much. One of the buildings I spend a bit of time on is the First Temple Beth El, which is such a perfect building for describing the milieu that you described. The second.
Yes,
The second one.
yes.
The first and the second, because he did them both. Yeah. So you can look at that part of the book. Yeah.
And you know, of course, that he built in New York.
Of course, I was involved in the effort to try to save that building, which I gather we failed to do.
Yeah, and the one other thing that we all were aware of was that he was such an innovator in the use of concrete. So even though these buildings were often clad in very traditional ornamentation, underneath they were not made traditionally out of wood and
concrete and steel,
Yeah.
Oftentimes, so a couple things. The Kahn family is a very interesting group. Albert and his first two brothers were born in Germany, and the rest of the siblings, actually, two of the sisters as well. In fact, only two of the children were born in the United States of his siblings. So they came across when he was 11 years old. He was the oldest sibling, and that was the last.
Most of this milieu came out in 1840.
But he was born in 1869, so yeah. Yeah.
He's married to a distant cousin.
Okay. I have many friends among the Kahn family relatives. Yeah. Right. What else did you say? So yes, there is this very important milieu of Reformed German Jews in Detroit. And part of the reason I think that Kahn worked so diligently during World War II to build up the military industrial complex was partly that he knew what was happening in Germany, and he knew it was really crucial to get the factories finished and to get them online earlier than had been planned. And supposedly he did that. So there's that. And yes, reinforced concrete. His brother Julius is the inventor of the system that's called Truss Kahn. And Kahn used it in many, many buildings. Michael Smith argues that Julius really should get all the credit for this very important company that then was bought by Republic Steel and becomes a kind of general building products company. I was fascinated at the way it traveled across the entire British imperial world through the Anglophone networks of the British Empire that preceded it. So you find Truss Kahn buildings in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Malaysia, all over in Scandinavia, literally everywhere. You find this system much more pervasive than the buildings built by the Kahn office. So yeah, that's a super interesting. It's an enormous topic. I mean, there is plenty more to say about the extent of the work of this group of people. Yeah.
Thank you, Claire.
Nice to see you.
I was wondering, so you brought up a couple of very important tropes of internationalists, of the international style, in the question of functionalism, the architecture or the building as a machine, to like international exchanges, and then kind of the actors from like Adolf Behner to in the book you talk about Miss Mandaro quite a bit. So I'm wondering to what extent your book offers a take on that development, whether it's a rereading of kind of the emergence of internationalist style, or kind of a provincializing of that question.
I'm gonna ask you when you're done reading it to tell me that. I tried not to make it about the international style. I thought that was sort of the problem with our history of the 20th century, was that it focused too much on that history. So I didn't intend for it to. I don't even go into depth about his relationship to the Bauhaus, in part because these other people have done it. Michael Hodges did it in his in his celebration of Kahn, and Chris Meister does it in his extremely biased treatment of modernism in a book that'll come out in a couple of months. I didn't feel I had to do it, so I tried not to. I would say the bit on Mies is just in the end to try to give me some credit for acknowledging what Kahn had done in a way that I think hasn't also appeared in the literature very much. So I think that Mies was aware and was ambivalent for many reasons about what World War II meant in terms of construction and destruction. So there I do at the end of the book turn to that development. But otherwise I think I was trying to do it more by simply making a different argument, one that could be read as a supplement to our history of modernism, but wouldn't be configured by it, if you know what I mean. And I think, you know, to immediately shift the focus to construction, or to balance the focus between design, construction, and use is the way that I hope to do that, I think. Does that answer that question? Yeah. John.
Hey, hi, Clara.
Hi. Really great to see you guys, by the way.
Yeah, you too. And I look forward to that coffee.
Oh, yes. After that.
I'm gonna let the.
There's 4 of you here, though. I thought you would be the only one.
Well, we can share one coffee. We can pass it down on the train. So can I ask you a somewhat dogmatic political economy question?
You can. I don't know if I can answer it, though.
Okay, well, I'm gonna let your critique of labor history slide off my back for now.
Okay.
So I want to get into the specifics of what you identified pretty early on in the book as a central theme, which is this idea of industrial architecture, the building as a fixed capital outlay that can be subsidized in 2 ways. First, through the exploitation of fluctuations in the market for raw materials, and second, through the suppression of wages.
Yeah.
And that these considerations shape decisions about the built environment and so on. And I'm interested in the second concern, that of wages.
Mm-hmm.
So in the section of Capital on relative surplus value, Marx is arguing that, that's right.
Just make sure you give it all to us here, because we.
Okay, so Marx is arguing that the cutting of wages, the accelerating the tempo of production through mechanization, coercion, or other means, and prolonging the working day, they all operate according to the same principle of augmenting surplus labor, or expanding the gulf between the value of finished commodities and initial variable capital outlays by depressing the value of labor power. And so my question for you is, like, if you buy into all of that, which I think maybe you do after having taken your class, how should we conceptualize architectural history, history of the built environment, as showing the reification of these different kinds of techniques of accelerating the production of relative surplus value, and better yet, are they reflected in the thinking of Fortis architects and planners?
Okay, I think I can answer that in part, but I would say this is very much in progress in my thinking. That is to say, I am very much an architectural historian, so I don't know that I have a full answer for you yet, but I hope to. I would say that for the architects, it goes back to what I said about the speed of change between technologies and buildings. So buildings get built at the front end typically of a new technology, and it's at the front end. This isn't always the case, but it's at the front end that the relationship tends to be most harmonious, right? The employer has everything to gain from enlisting the workers to their cause. They're taking a risk. They don't know if it will work. They need to have a kind of unified organization The building is part of that, the workers are part of that, the product is part of that. The managers are part of that. And as we see at the present moment, as competition increases and as a product becomes successful, the maker begins to try to find ways to cut costs. And so if the costs are cut in the two areas that I described, cheapening the product or paying the workers less. And so the architect oftentimes evades this whole cycle because they've been part of the front end of that. Now, again, it's not always the case because buildings are in the Kahn universe, they're constantly getting tinkered with and added to and, you know, altered. But in general, I would say, while the architecture firm often practices the same thing in its office of exploitation of workers, in its design of buildings, it's less able to be captured as a force for capital if the problem is the business cycle. Does that make sense? Because the building's already built. So, and architects are always constantly making the case for having more expense attached to the building than their clients would like, because they're trying to make a better building for maybe good reasons and maybe reasons of their own publicity, but they are usually trying to grab money from the client as much as they can, I think. And so I think those two facts have obscured the relationship between designing architects and the exploitation of the appropriation of workers' labor. Now, I'm happy to debate that with people because maybe there are other ways of thinking about it, but I think it might be one of the reasons why we haven't, in the architectural history sphere, we haven't sufficiently robustly engaged this question. We've been able to sort of circumvent it or evade it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. I can email you about that.
I mean, I'm happy to be challenged here because I certainly am not a Marxist labor historian, and we know that.
So I guess a more mechanized or a swifter, more contiguous assembly line, which is more conducive to discipline and control, by that line of reasoning, does not figure in this iterative process of better buildings.
Personally, Kahn hated the assembly line, and the Highland Park plant is made as part of the reason that I was interested in it is because it's in that building that the assembly line is invented. And it's not a happy marriage. It's a horrible way to work in the auto industry, or it was then. It's probably less horrible now because it's so much more mechanized and so it depends so much less on human labor. But the building is constantly resisting the optimizations of the assembly line. It's already built, one, and it's made of concrete. Like you have to get a hole into the floor. It's quite a serious operation to change the kind of workflow within the building. There's quite a bit of work that has to be done. And it's very skinny because it was made to be a daylight factory. So it's not actually very flexible to the workings of the assembly line. And that, in fact, is why within 2 years of kind of perfecting the basic principles of assembly line production, Ford was looking to the Rouge. He bought that land in 1915. The mobile assembly line comes online in the beginning of 1914, end of 1913. Within 2 years, he's already decided it's hopeless. That he has to buy the land at the Rouge, where he can lay things out with really big building envelopes that can be lit from above, so they don't have to be skinny. Where you can have the assembly line kind of roping around any way you want. So again, architecture is subject to the change of labor practices. And Kahn goes right along, and Audi goes to River Rouge and designs all those buildings out there except for the Foundry building, which is like the worst of all the buildings at the Rouge, I think, in terms of labor.
Well, since we're sort of at our time and we've returned to the essential image and reality of the assembly line with Albert Kahn, I think that seems a really appropriate place to thank Claire and to enjoy a reception and ask her some more questions.